He was never supposed to be the hero. Yet when the walls of justice collapsed and the most trusted man in the city revealed his true face, it wasn't a judge, a lawyer, or a cop who rose to stop it. It was a dog. In the smoke and fear, when men fled and loyalty faltered, he stood alone, unwavering. With a single growl, he exposed betrayal at the heart of power, and with every step, he chased a truth too dangerous for anyone else to carry. He was trained to obey, but in that moment, he chose to lead, dragging a fallen officer through fire, standing defiant against a system built on lies. This is not just a story about corruption, betrayal, or redemption. This is the story of one dog who refused to run when the world demanded silence. If this journey moved you, if you believe loyalty has the power to change everything, leave a like, subscribe to walk with us through more stories like this, and tell us, where are you watching from, and which moment left you holding your breath? I would love to hear your voice in the comments. The rain had just stopped falling over the city of Fairfield, leaving a thin mist hanging in the air like a breath held too long. The towering courthouse loomed against the steel gray sky, its steps glistening under the reluctant light of late afternoon. Inside, the marble floors whispered with the muted shuffle of well-dressed feet. Elijah Brooks adjusted the crisp cuffs of his dark blue uniform, his badge catching a dull glint under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, Shadow, his German Shepherd partner, walked with poised silence, muscles taut beneath his black and tan coat. They were a striking pair, a mountain of steady resolve and a creature carved from pure instinct. Today, Elijah had been assigned to oversee security detail for a critical trial involving a high-profile whistleblower testifying against one of the city's most untouchable crime syndicates. Everyone in the building knew this wasn't just another day in court, and Shadow, usually stoic and obedient, seemed to sense it in the very air. The courthouse buzzed with low, anxious energy. Lawyers whispered in tight circles. Clerks darted between chambers, their arms burdened with heavy files. As Elijah passed through the security checkpoint, he noticed how Shadow's ears twitched sharply, nose flaring slightly at invisible scents carried by unseen currents. "Easy, boy," Elijah muttered under his breath, giving a reassuring tug at the leash. But Shadow's gaze was unwavering, locked onto something beyond the bustling crowd. The main courtroom was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow, dim chandeliers casting pools of light that barely touched the stone walls. At the far end, the judge's bench presided with severe authority, draped in the solemnity of American justice. Rows of polished pews filled with journalists, officers, attorneys, and a handful of spectators buzzed like a nervous hive. Elijah led Shadow to a post near the front, between the gallery and the plaintiff's table. From this spot, he could see everything: the judge, the jury, the defendant, the witness stand. It was the perfect vantage point. Shadow sat by his side, still, yet his breathing was faster than normal. Elijah gave him a sideways glance, frowning. "What's gotten into you today?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. As if on cue, the heavy doors creaked open, and everyone turned to watch. Judge Alan Whitmore entered, robes flowing behind him like a slow-moving shadow. He climbed the steps to his bench with mechanical dignity. All rose. Elijah stood too, feeling the shift in the room's energy, a tightening, as if the very walls leaned in to lift. "Be seated," Judge Whitmore intoned, his voice as rough as gravel yet hollow. Elijah scanned the room, noting the familiar faces of the sharp-suited prosecutors, the defense team whispering urgently amongst themselves, the pale figure of the key witness clutching a battered briefcase like a lifeline. Everything looked ordinary, almost too ordinary, as the judge shuffled his papers, preparing to call the court to order. Shadow's body stiffened, his hackles raised almost imperceptibly. Elijah caught it instantly, instinct sharpening. He followed Shadow's gaze. There at the defense table sat a man in a gray suit, neatly trimmed beard, an expensive watch half hidden by a custom-tailored sleeve. Nothing about him screamed danger, and yet, Elijah saw it in Shadow's body. Absolute tension. A vibration in the leash. A low, warning growl rumbling from deep within Shadow's chest. Elijah tightened his grip, shooting a quick glance at the bailiff, who frowned disapprovingly at the noise. "Shadow," he warned under his breath, voice low but firm. "Control." But Shadow wasn't reacting randomly. Elijah knew his partner better than he knew himself. This was a signal. A message. Danger close and disguised. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and lifted his gavel. This court is now in session for the case of State versus Leon Caldwell, he began. At that exact moment, Shadow's muscles coiled. He leaned forward slightly, a tremor running through his entire body. His growl deepened, sharp enough to cut through the judge's voice like a blade. Several heads turned. Whispering started to ripple through the room. Elijah yanked gently at the leash again. He remained settling back onto his haunches, but his amber eyes never left the man. The defendant, Caldwell, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, throwing a nervous glance toward his attorney. But it wasn't Caldwell that Shadow was staring at. It was someone else, someone less obvious. Elijah followed the line of Shadow's glare, straight to a junior member of the defense team, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and an impassive expression, scribbling notes furiously. Elijah's gut twisted. Something about the way the man's hand trembled slightly, the rigid set of his jaw. Shadow wasn't wrong. He never was. Just as Elijah opened his mouth to quietly request a check on the individual, the man in question caught him looking and froze, mid-scribble. For a second too long, it was all the confirmation Elijah needed. Beside him, Shadow let out another low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. Elijah's hand instinctively dropped to the holster at his hip. The trial had only just begun and already the air was charged with an electric dread. Something was terribly wrong, and Shadow had seen it before anyone else. The low growl vibrating from Shadow's chest hadn't faded even after the judge officially opened the court session. Elijah kept a tight hand on the leash, feeling every tremor of tension radiating through the thick leather. The words spoken in the courtroom, the preliminary formalities, the introductions of counsel, the calling of witnesses blurred into background noise behind the unrelenting focus of Shadow's gaze. His partner wasn't simply uneasy. He was locked onto something or someone with the full weight of a predator cornering prey. Elijah's training told him to trust that instinct, even when it defied logic. But standing orders demanded professionalism, silence, order. And so he hesitated. That hesitation cost him, as Judge Whitmore rose from the bench to confer privately with the attorneys near the sidebar. Shadow suddenly surged forward, yanking Elijah off balance. The German shepherd, with surprising force, threw himself directly into the narrow aisle, blocking the judge's path. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like wind across tall grass. People leaned forward, eyes widening. "Control your animal," the judge snapped, voice cutting through the rising murmurs. Elijah flushed, yanking hard on the leash, commanding, "Shadow, heel, now." Shadow didn't budge. He stood planted, hackles raised, body a living barricade. It wasn't aggression, it was defense. It was a warning. Elijah saw it playing tables. The dog wasn't attacking, he was shielding, blocking, protecting. Judge Whitmore glared down, visibly rattled, and took an awkward step back. Bailiffs moved instinctively toward Elijah, hands hovering near their own holsters. The atmosphere, already strained, thinned to near suffocation. Elijah wrestled internally for a split second before forcing Shadow back with a series of firm, whispered commands. Shadow resisted for a breath, then reluctantly yielded, falling into a tense sit beside Elijah's boot. The courtroom slowly settled, but an undercurrent of fear had been loosed, and it buzzed in every whispered conversation, every suspicious glance. Elijah caught the wary look the judge shot him before resuming the proceedings. A look not of gratitude but of distrust. As Whitmore shuffled back toward the bench, Elijah's gaze roamed the perimeter of the room. That's when he saw it. Just a flicker, just a shadow at the very edge of his vision. A movement that didn't fit the rehearsed chaos of court ritual. The court clerk, young, sharp-suited, blending seamlessly among the sea of officials, crossed near the side door, the entrance used exclusively by judges and high-profile personnel. In a movement so quick most would miss it, the clerk tilted his clipboard toward the door, his thumb brushing subtly in a signal gesture. A nod, he returned to his post without incident, his face blank, but his pulse, Elijah bet, was hammering under that starched collar. Shadow let out another growl, quieter this time, but Elijah caught it. He knelt slightly, whispering close to his partner's ear. "I see it too, buddy. Stay sharp." The judge continued speaking, droning about courtroom protocol and the importance of decorum. But Elijah's mind wasn't on the words. His focus was pinned on the strange, secretive signal and the way Shadow, impeccable, unfailing, refused to stand down. Something was happening, something coordinated, something unseen by most, but not by them. Across the courtroom, the man with the glasses, the one Shadow had fixated on earlier, tapped his pen nervously against his yellow notepad. His knuckles were white, sweat beaded at his temples. Elijah knew what he was seeing. Body language screamed louder than words ever could. Stress, fear, guilt. A crack in the polished veneer, and cracks widened under pressure. A bailiff sidled up beside Elijah, voice low but firm. "Officer Brooks, you're disrupting court proceedings. If you can't keep that dog under control, you'll be asked to remove him." Elijah stiffened. He opened his mouth to argue, to explain that Shadow's behavior wasn't disorder, it was detection. But he caught the sharp look from Judge Whitmore and swallowed his protest. Not yet. Not without proof. Not without something undeniable. He gave a clipped nod. "Understood, sir," he murmured. He patted Shadow's flank reassuringly, feeling the muscles twitch under his palm. "We're not done," he whispered. Shadow blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if understanding passed between them. The session dragged. Legal arguments unfurled like poisoned vines, wrapping the room in layers of half-truths and formalities. But Elijah heard none of it. He watched, he waited, he traced every glance, every movement. Shadow mirrored him, breathing slow but alert, eyes shifting between the judge, the defense table, and the court staff. The sense of wrongness grew heavier, thick enough to taste a copper tang on the back of Elijah's tongue. Then, another movement. A second signal. The same court clerk, now lingering too long near the judge's bench under the pretense of delivering files, subtly tilted his clipboard again, another small hand movement, this time toward a different door, the jury entrance. Elijah's mind raced. Multiple exits, multiple players, a plan unfolding right under the sanctity of the law. His skin crawled. He caught the motion out of the corner of his eye. Someone in the public seating area shifting uneasily. A large man in a beige jacket, hands deep in pockets, face partially hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap. He wasn't paying attention to the trial. His focus was on the doors, on the movements, on the signals. Elijah's fingers flexed reflexively near his belt. Shadow growled again, lower this time, vibrating against Elijah's shin. A warning, a clock counting down, and still no one else noticed. No one else saw. Only them. Only the silent witness with fur and teeth, and the man who had learned to listen when the world told him to look away. Elijah's heart hammered a war drum rhythm in his ears as he realized they weren't just witnessing a trial. They were standing in the middle of a trap that was about to spring. The gavel struck wood with a hollow clack that echoed across the chamber like a warning shot. "We'll take a brief recess," Judge Whitmore announced, his voice too sharp, too hurried for a man simply pausing proceedings. The jurors filed out obediently, the murmuring crowd trickled toward the exits, and the attorneys huddled into tight, murmuring groups. Elijah stayed rooted in place, his body coiled, his mind racing. Beside him, Shadow sat taut, his ears rotating like radar dishes picking up invisible signals. The room felt wrong, hollowed out, like a bomb ticking quietly under polished wood and marble. Judge Whitmore descended from the bench, his robe sweeping behind him like a black wave. As he passed, Shadow's nose twitched furiously, his body pivoting in a precise arc to track the judge's movement. Elijah's hand tensed on the leash. He almost missed it. Shadow's entire posture shifted subtly, from watchfulness to sharp, predatory focus. Elijah followed the dog's gaze down, instinct screaming in his blood. There, against the dark hem of the judge's robe where it brushed the inner lining of his tailored suit, was something out of place. A stain, a dark, rusty smear the size of a fingerprint, just above the cuff of Whitmore's immaculate sleeve. Blood, old enough to have dried into the fabric but fresh enough that it hadn't been cleaned properly. Elijah's breath hitched. Logic reeled. There was no reason for a judge, a figure who should be untouched by the visceral violence of the street, to carry blood on his clothing into a courtroom. Unless he hadn't merely judged violence. Unless he had touched it, been part of it. Shadow let out a low, almost imperceptible whine, the sound vibrating up the leash and into Elijah's bones. No one else noticed. No one else saw. Elijah masked his reaction, slipping into the practiced neutrality he had honed over years of service. But inside, his mind was a battlefield. The clerk with the hidden signals, the strange movements, the defendant's nervousness, and now blood. He knelt beside Shadow, ostensibly checking the dog's harness, but in reality whispering, "Stay close, we're onto something." Across the room, the bailiff's eyes narrowed at him suspiciously, but Elijah ignored it. If what he suspected was even half true, this wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a crime scene waiting to explode. The judge exited through the side door, accompanied by 2 security officers, neither of whom seemed to notice or care about the bloodstain. Elijah's instincts screamed louder. He needed more. He needed something undeniable before he could act, something that would rip away the facade of authority shielding whatever was festering here. Moving with casual purpose, Elijah guided Shadow along the edges of the room under the guise of a routine perimeter check. No one stopped him. No one cared. Their attention was elsewhere. Coffee breaks, whispered strategy meetings, private phone calls in shadowed corners. Elijah approached the judge's bench cautiously. From this angle, he could see the heavy oak chair pushed slightly askew, its shadow long and reaching toward the gallery like a crooked finger. Shadow sniffed the air, his nose working furiously, his body stiff with unease. Elijah crouched beside the chair, pretending to tie his boot, his eyes scanning every inch of the space beneath and around the judge's platform. Then he saw it, wedged under the frame of the chair, hidden just beneath the overhang of the heavy wooden paneling. Something metallic gleamed dully in the low light. Elijah's pulse spiked. He reached out carefully, fingers brushing the cold surface. His hand closed around a small, hard object. He pulled it free. A handgun, matte black, no serial number, no registration marks. A ghost weapon, illegal to own, let alone conceal inside a federal courthouse. Elijah's mouth went dry. He slipped the weapon quickly into a hidden pocket of his tactical vest, covering the move with a cough. His mind raced. He needed to document this, he needed backup, but whom could he trust? Certainly not the internal staff, maybe not even the bailiffs. Shadow pressed against his thigh, sensing the spike in adrenaline, the shift in energy. Elijah rose smoothly, feigning nonchalance, and guided Shadow toward the hallway that led to the secure communications room. If he could get even 5 minutes alone, he could report this up the chain, bypassing local corruption. But as they crossed the threshold into the side corridor, he caught movement in the corner of his eye, the same young clerk from before, stepping into a shadowed alcove, speaking hurriedly into a burner phone. Shadow growled low in his throat, his body rigid. Elijah's gut clenched tighter. This wasn't just courtroom politics. This was organized, coordinated. Shadow suddenly lunged forward, dragging Elijah 2 steps toward the alcove before he pulled him back. The clerk snapped his head up, startled, locking eyes with Elijah for a split second before vanishing through a service door labeled staff only. Elijah hesitated, every fiber of training warning him against pursuing alone. But time was shredding away like burned paper. He couldn't afford to lose the trail. He needed evidence, proof. And right now, the bloodstain and the ghost gun weighed heavily against the scales of caution. Shadow whimpered impatiently, muscles taut with barely restrained energy. Elijah made his decision. Fast, quiet, and visible. He turned, adjusting the fit of his jacket over the bulge of the confiscated weapon, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Ahead, the service hallway loomed, dim and whispering with unseen threats. He didn't know what he would find on the other side, but he knew what was at stake. Elijah moved swiftly, Shadow pressed against his side, both blending into the muted corridors beyond the courtroom. The service hallway smelled of dust and old varnish, a stagnant scent that clung to the walls like a film. Somewhere deeper in the maze of back passages, the young clerk had vanished, leaving only the echo of hurried footsteps behind. Elijah weighed the risk of pursuit against the immediate need to secure the evidence he had hidden. The unregistered gun, the blood-stained observation, and chose caution. He retraced his steps toward the main courtroom as the recess ended, his mind burning through scenarios like a wildfire. As he entered the room once more, the air felt heavier, charged, as if everyone sensed the powder keg building in the shadows but pretended not to see it. Jurors filed back to their seats, their faces solemn, untouched by the true danger swirling invisibly around them. Shadow's ears flattened slightly, a clear sign he was picking up something Elijah couldn't yet pinpoint. The session resumed with a suddenness that jolted the room. The prosecution called their key witness to the stand, a slender man in a gray suit named Jeremy Cole, an accountant for the Caldwell organization who had allegedly turned whistleblower. Jeremy had been expected to deliver testimony that would sink the defendant beyond salvation. His statements in pre-trial positions had been clear, damning, filled with meticulous details about bribes, illegal arms deals, and hidden offshore accounts. Elijah watched closely, noting how Jeremy's hands trembled as he took the oath, how his Adam's apple bobbed too sharply when he swallowed. There was something brittle about him, like a tree branch under the weight of too much ice. The prosecutor approached with a quiet confidence. "Mr. Cole," she began, "can you tell the court about the financial transfers you witnessed involving Mr. Caldwell?" A long pause stretched, elastic and unbearable. Jeremy licked his lips, shifted in his seat, and finally spoke, his voice cracking under the strain. I made a mistake," he said, the words landing like stones in a pond, sending ripples across the room. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen from the air. The prosecutor blinked, momentarily thrown. "Excuse me, Mr. Cole?" Jeremy clutched the edges of the witness stand as if to anchor himself. His eyes, wide and desperate, flickered toward Judge Whitmore, and there it was. Elijah saw it, the unmistakable flash of terror. Not fear of the defendant, fear of the man in the robe. The judge. Jeremy's voice wavered but pressed on. "I misunderstood some of the transactions. They weren't illegal. I must have been wrong." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The defense team exchanged sharp glances, barely concealing their triumph. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order. Elijah's blood turned to ice. This wasn't nerves. It wasn't second-guessing. It was coercion. Shadow, who had been tense but controlled at Elijah's side, suddenly jerked his head toward the witness stand, nostrils flaring. He emitted a low, urgent whine, eyes locked beneath the bench. Elijah followed his partner's cue instinctively. He adjusted his position subtly, moving closer to the rail that divided the gallery from the court floor. From this angle, he could just barely see under the witness stand, a faint glint of something metallic, tucked up against the paneling where no one should have access. Shadow growled again, drawing the attention of a few nearby spectators. But Elijah didn't care. He recognized the posture. Scent detection. His heart kicked against his ribs. Something was hidden there, something that didn't belong. Elijah tapped his earpiece, pretending to adjust it while activating the micro-recorder embedded in his uniform. He needed a record of this. Every second could count. Jeremy Cole continued to unravel on the stand, backpedaling on prior statements, his testimony dissolving into useless ambiguity. The prosecutor attempted to recover, but the damage was done. The defense would rip this to shreds on cross-examination, and Elijah could already hear the sound of a case dying under the gavel. Meanwhile, Shadow's focus remained unwavering. Elijah knew he had to act. But how? An overt move to search the stand could provoke suspicion, compromise his credibility, or worse, alert whoever was orchestrating this circus. He needed a distraction. Luckily, fate or Shadow provided one. As Jeremy faltered through another non-committal answer, Shadow surged forward, barking sharply. The sudden noise shattered the brittle tension. Jeremy startled, dropping his notes with a flurry of paper. Jurors recoiled instinctively. The judge slammed his gavel again, his face thunderous. "Control that animal or remove him," Whitmore barked, voice booming across the chamber. Elijah used the chaos. He darted forward under the pretense of restraining Shadow. Crouching low near the witness stand, his hands swept deftly under the bench, fingers closing around a small rectangular device taped crudely to a recorder, old-school analog, cheap, disposable. Elijah's stomach twisted with grim confirmation. He palmed the device, slipping it into an inner pocket in one smooth motion before rising to haul Shadow back into heel position. The courtroom buzzed with outrage, confusion, and disapproval. Elijah let it wash over him, let them think he had lost control of his dog. Better that than expose what he had just found. Shadow leaned against his leg, vibrating with tension but silent now, as if satisfied their mission had succeeded. Jeremy resumed his seat, face pale and sweating, his testimony now fully corrupted. Elijah locked eyes briefly with the judge, who stared back at him with a coldness that chilled his spine. There was no misunderstanding anymore, no gray area. The court wasn't just compromised, it was hijacked. A web of threats and fear wrapped around every figure of authority in this room. Elijah's fingers tightened unconsciously around the hidden recorder. Somewhere inside that tiny machine might be the thread to unravel everything. If he could get it out safely, if he could survive long enough to play it. The judge's gavel pounded furiously against the bench, the heavy sound cracking the strained silence like a whip. "Officer Brooks," Judge Whitmore barked, his voice dripping with contempt, thinly veiled as authority. "Your dog has disrupted these proceedings for the last time. Remove yourself and the animal from this courtroom immediately." Elijah stiffened under the weight of dozens of eyes drilling into his back. The jurors stared with uneasy fascination. The defense attorneys exchanged smirking glances, and even the prosecutors looked wary, unwilling to challenge the command of the bench. Shadow stood pressed against Elijah's leg, chest heaving slightly but eyes sharp, trained not on the judge, not on the jury, but somewhere beyond. Somewhere deeper. Elijah opened his mouth to protest, the hidden recorder heavy in his pocket, the blood stain and the ghost gun vivid in his mind. But he saw the danger in that moment, saw the setup. If he resisted, he would be branded insubordinate, dangerous, unstable. The narrative would shift instantly. Rogue officer with an aggressive animal, undermining court decorum. No, he had to move carefully. He nodded stiffly, throat dry, and clipped Shadow's leash short. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, voice low and even. A few spectators murmured approval as Elijah turned, guiding Shadow toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom. To them, it was simple. The dog was a nuisance, and Elijah, by extension, an embarrassment. No one questioned why a decorated canine would behave so wildly. No one wondered what might provoke an animal trained for discipline and valor to such desperate measures. As they approached the exit, Elijah felt Shadow's tension spike like a live wire humming under his skin. The shepherd's ears pinned back, his muscles coiled, and his pace slowed, resisting Elijah's tug on the leash. "Come on, buddy," Elijah muttered, urgency tightening his... They reached the threshold, the brass handles of the door gleaming dully under the fluorescent lights. Elijah reached for the bar. Shadow lunged. Without warning, without hesitation, the dog twisted sharply, jaws snapping onto Elijah's jacket sleeve with a force that yanked him sideways, off balance. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that for a heartbeat Elijah thought Shadow had lost control completely. Then the world split open. A sound like a thunderclap erupted from the direction of the judge's bench. A sharp, concussive crack that punched the air from Elijah's lungs and shattered the courtroom's composure in an instant. Screams burst from the gallery as people ducked and scrambled, chairs scraping violently across the floor. Elijah, hauled halfway to the emergency exit by Shadow's iron grip, whipped his head around just in time to see smoke curling upward from beneath the judge's platform, black and greasy and wrong. The stained oak of the bench splintered outward in jagged shards. Panic detonated through the courtroom like a secondary blast. Jurors stumbled over each other, some diving to the floor, others bolting toward the exits. The defense team flattened themselves behind their table, eyes wide with primal fear. For a split second, in the chaotic swirl of bodies and noise, Elijah's gaze locked with Judge Whitmore's across the fractured expanse. The judge's face, usually so composed, twisted now into something raw and unguarded, not fear, Elijah realized, but rage. The blast hadn't been an accident. It had been a signal, a purge, and Elijah wasn't meant to survive it. Shadow dragged him toward the fire exit with unrelenting strength, his body low and purposeful, instincts overriding every ounce of training. Elijah stumbled after him, adrenaline roaring through his veins, one hand fumbling for the emergency latch. Behind them, the courtroom dissolved into a war zone, overturned furniture, shrieking witnesses, the acrid bite of smoke filling every breath. A second explosion sounded, fainter but distinct, somewhere deeper in the building. Secondary charges, contingency. Elijah slammed his shoulder into the door, Shadow bolting through the gap first, the two of them spilling into a narrow, dimly lit service corridor that reeked of disinfectant and old sweat. He didn't slow, didn't dare. He trusted Shadow's instincts implicitly now. They had just saved his life. Feet pounding the concrete floor, Elijah clutched the recorder in his pocket, like a talisman, heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might shatter. Behind them, the courthouse continued to erupt in chaos, sirens wailing from somewhere distant, alarms blaring overhead. The blast had torn away the mask of civility, exposing the rot festering underneath. He didn't know yet how deep it went, didn't know how many players were involved, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He and Shadow were no longer just observers. They were targets, and they were running out of time. The emergency hallway stretched ahead of them like a vein through the courthouse's hidden anatomy, dimly lit by flickering fluorescence that buzzed angrily overhead. Elijah ran with Shadow at his side, boots hammering against the cracked linoleum floor, every breath a ragged gasp dragging fire into his lungs. Behind them, the muffled sounds of chaos filtered through the heavy doors, shouting, distant screams, the growing wail of approaching sirens. But they were already too far gone to look back. Elijah's mind raced as fast as his feet, pieces of the puzzle slamming together with brutal clarity. The explosions had been deliberate, targeted not at the gallery, not at the press or public observers, but at the court itself, at the structures housing the judges, the witnesses, the records. It hadn't been a random act of terror. It had been surgical, a purge designed to erase something or someone. Jeremy Cole. The thought stabbed into Elijah's brain like an electric shock. The star witness, the only direct link tying Caldwell to the network of corruption, had sat exposed just feet from the detonation. If not for Shadow, Elijah realized, he would have been among the first casualties, and without witnesses, without testimony, the case would collapse, buried under fear and legal technicalities. Shadow skidded to a halt at a crossroads in the hallway, ears pricked, nose testing the currents of stale air. Elijah bent low, trusting his partner's instincts once more. The shepherd jerked his head to the right, where a battered exit sign buzzed weakly above a maintenance stairway. Without hesitation, Elijah followed, boots clanging against rusted metal steps as they descended into the underbelly of the building. They burst into a service corridor lined with storage closets and access doors, their breaths loud against the oppressive quiet. Elijah knew they couldn't stay hidden long. Whoever had orchestrated this chaos would already be sweeping the exits, hunting survivors. They needed cover, a plan. Shadow's nose led them to a half-open door labeled records. Elijah ducked inside, pulling the door almost shut behind them. Dust and mildew clung to the air inside, and rows of filing cabinets stretched away into darkness like silent sentries. He crouched, Shadow pressing close, heart pounding against his ribs. Think, move, survive. Elijah pulled the stolen recorder from his vest, his fingers trembling slightly as he fumbled to rewind the tape. A soft click, static, then voices. He turned the volume low, straining to hear. Once the explosion hits, clear the witness, gravelly male voice said, thick with authority and cold calculation. Sweep the rest if needed. Focus on Cole. Another voice answered, nervous but eager. And the dog team? A pause. Then the first voice again, colder than before. Collateral. Elijah's gut twisted. They had known about him, about Shadow. They had planned for their deaths. His fists tightened around the recorder, fury and fear warring within him. He played back the recording again, focusing on the first voice. There was something familiar about it, something he couldn't quite place. A scrape at the door yanked Elijah back to the present. He shoved the recorder into his pocket, drew his sidearm silently, and flattened against the wall. A shadow passed by outside. Heavy boots, radio static, men hunting. Elijah held his breath until the footsteps receded. He needed answers, not just proof. The recorder was enough to raise questions, but not enough to expose the entire rot. He needed to know who was pulling the strings. A sudden memory surged up Jeremy Cole's terrified glance. Not at the defense, not at the press, but at the judge, Judge Whitmore. Elijah felt cold seep into his bones. The pieces fell into place with a sickening inevitability. Whitmore had orchestrated the bombing. Whitmore had set the stage for the witness to be silenced, for the evidence to vanish in fire and smoke. And if Whitmore was involved, then the corruption ran deeper than Elijah had dared imagine. Shadow whined softly, sensing the shift in Elijah's breathing, the new weight settling on his shoulders. Elijah rose silently, moving deeper into the archive room, searching for anything, files, logs, maintenance plans that could tell him where Jeremy Cole might have been taken if he survived. His fingers brushed over old case folders, crumbling ledgers, until he found a maintenance schematic of the courthouse taped to the back of a cabinet. He traced the layout quickly, noting emergency exits, restricted zones, blind spots. One corridor in particular caught his eye, a service tunnel leading to a decommissioned holding wing, long abandoned since the courthouse's last renovation. If you needed a place to stash a bleeding witness, somewhere off the official maps but still within easy reach, that's where you would go. Elijah memorized the route, shoved the diagram into his jacket, and turned to Shadow. "Let's move, boy," he whispered. Shadow's tail flicked once, a silent acknowledgement. They slipped back into the hallway, every nerve raw and thrumming with urgency. Somewhere above them, the building screamed with sirens and confusion. But down here, in the veins and arteries of the structure, it was silent, save for their breath and the soft padding of paws on concrete. Elijah didn't know how long they had before someone realized the recorder was missing, before the order came to sweep and kill. But he knew time was bleeding out fast, and he knew he couldn't fail, not now. The tunnels narrowed as Elijah and Shadow pushed deeper into the abandoned underbelly of the courthouse, the damp concrete walls pressing in with a suffocating closeness that magnified every heartbeat and footstep into echoes of urgency. Elijah's mind ran as fast as his body, the realization of Judge Whitmore's betrayal gnawing at him like acid. Each memory of the judge's commanding presence now warped into a mask hiding rot beneath polished authority. As they reached a rusted metal door marked "Restricted Access," Elijah paused, placing a steadying hand on Shadow's back, feeling the faint tremble of tension vibrating through the shepherd's powerful frame. He pressed his ear to the door, hearing nothing but the hum of old ventilation shafts, then slowly turned the handle and slipped inside, moving low and fast. They entered a forgotten section of the building, dust thick enough to mute even their hurried steps. Discarded filing cabinets and broken furniture lining the walls like skeletal remains of a system that had long since devoured itself. Somewhere ahead, Jeremy Cole might still be alive, and with him, the key to dismantling the entire corrupt machine Whitmore had engineered. But even as Elijah focused on survival, his instincts demanded more answers. History, context, because nothing this massive happened overnight. As they moved, Elijah pulled out his burner phone, the one piece of tech Whitmore's people wouldn't have compromised, and typed a coded message to an old contact in internal affairs, a friend from his academy days who owed him more than a few favors. If there was anything official on Whitmore, any buried investigations or whispers of misconduct, it would surface now. The reply came faster than he expected. A single encrypted attachment blinking into his inbox. A redacted investigation file, years old, deemed inconclusive. Elijah's heart hammered as he read, crouched behind a half-collapsed filing cabinet with Shadow's breath warm against his thigh. In terse, bureaucratic language, the report detailed suspicions that Judge Whitmore had accepted bribes, large ones, funneled through dummy corporations tied to the Marquez Syndicate, the most brutal and powerful criminal organization the city had ever known. Case after case handled by Whitmore bore quiet patterns. Technicalities dismissed without appeal, evidence suppressed, witnesses intimidated into silence. But without a smoking gun, the investigation had fizzled, buried under political pressure and fear. Elijah's fists clenched until his knuckles whitened. He had trusted that man, sworn to uphold the justice Whitmore presided over, and all the while the judge had been a puppet master for the very darkness they were supposed to fight. Shadow shifted beside him, nose working furiously, and Elijah reached instinctively for the dog's collar, grounding himself. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" he whispered hoarsely. The Shadow tilted his head, as if understanding ran deeper than words, and something clicked in Elijah's mind, a memory, a buried conversation from his early days handling canine units, about a legendary shepherd named Rex, a dog who had been instrumental in bringing down one of Marquez's largest drug trafficking rings years ago. Rex had been feared and hated by the Syndicate, a living weapon that had torn through their operations with precision no human agent could match. Elijah's gaze dropped to Shadow, watching the familiar tilt of the head, the set of the shoulders, the fierce, unwavering loyalty blazing in Ember eyes. It couldn't be coincidence. Elijah dug into his mental archives, recalling the lineage of the dogs assigned to the courthouse security program. Shadow's file had always been oddly sparse, just a mention of his breeder, the cryptic notation of Heritage K9. His blood ran from Rex. Shadow wasn't just another police dog. He was legacy, born from a line that had already struck mortal wounds into the heart of the Marquez Syndicate. And now they were back, closing the circle, using the system itself to eliminate the remaining threats to their empire. Elijah swore under his breath, rage surging through him, cleansing and clarifying. Whitmore had been bought by the Syndicate, secured by blood money and threats, and when a descendant of the dog that had once decimated their power base returned to the arena, fate had stitched a final battlefield across their paths. He squeezed Shadow's scruff gently, a silent vow passing between man and beast. They would not fall quietly. Shadow let out a low growl, nostrils flaring, and Elijah followed his lead through a warped door into another hallway, this one tighter, darker, the fluorescent lights above flickering like dying stars. At the far end, a heavy steel door loomed, its frame bent slightly from age and neglect. Beyond that door, Elijah knew, lay whatever scraps of truth they could salvage, or whatever trap awaited those too stubborn to die easily. He slipped closer, heart pounding not from fear but from certainty. They were not running anymore. They were hunting. The rusted steel door groaned against his hinges as Elijah pushed it open, the dim corridor beyond revealing itself like the throat of some great sleeping beast, lined with crumbling concrete and the scent of stagnant air. Shadow moved ahead, muscles tense beneath his sleek coat, every step precise and deliberate as if he anticipated an unseen ambush. Elijah's pulse pounded behind his eyes, every instinct screaming caution even as his mind steeled itself for confrontation. Somewhere beyond this decaying threshold, Jeremy Cole was either dead or holding on to life by a thread, and every second wasted was another second given to their enemies. They moved deeper, the hall narrowing until it was scarcely wide enough for them to pass side by side, the flickering overhead lights casting long trembling shadows that danced along the walls. Elijah's hand hovered near his holstered weapon, fingers itching with the need for decisive action, but he forced patience onto himself like a second skin. They rounded a corner, and there, standing in the center of the passage, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow, was Marcus Hale, Elijah's oldest friend from the security detail, the man who had once pulled him bleeding from a collapsed stairwell in the aftermath of a courthouse bombing years ago. Marcus lifted his hands in a calming gesture, his face lined with what looked like genuine relief. "Elijah," he said, voice low and urgent, "thank God you're alive. I thought you were gone after the second blast." Elijah hesitated, narrowing his eyes. Marcus was breathing hard, sweat glistening on his brow, but there was something off in the set of his shoulders, the twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes flickered not to Elijah's face but to something just beyond down the hall. "They're moving Marcus said quickly, words tumbling over each other. "They're taking him through the old maintenance tunnel, the one under the east wing. I can lead you." Shadow stiffened beside Elijah, his lips pulling back in a silent snarl that vibrated low and deep through his chest. Elijah laid a calming hand on the shepherd's back but never took his eyes off Marcus. "Why didn't you radio it in?" Elijah asked evenly. "Where's your comms gear?" Marcus hesitated a fraction too long. "Damaged in the blast," he said, too quickly, too rehearsed. Elijah's heart sank even as his face remained neutral. Marcus was lying. Worse, Marcus was leading him somewhere carefully chosen. Shadow whined under his breath, a sharp, warning note Elijah had learned never to ignore. Elijah smiled tightly, playing the part of the desperate, grateful survivor. "All right," he said, nodding. "Lead the way." Marcus relaxed fractionally, enough to turn his back, enough to lower his guard. They moved through the twisting corridors, deeper into the courthouse's forgotten veins, and Elijah watched everything, the way Marcus's hand kept brushing his belt where a weapon might be hidden, the way he kept glancing at side doors as if checking for markers. It was a setup. He could feel it in his bones. Marcus led them to a heavy maintenance door with a corroded lock hanging askew. "Through here," Marcus said, jerking his chin toward the darkness beyond. Shadow halted, muscles bunching, and let out a sharp, guttural bark that ricocheted off the narrow walls like a warning siren. Elijah shifted, adjusting his stance, and that was when he saw it, the faint glint of a tripwire stretched low across the doorway, nearly invisible in the gloom. His stomach turned to ice. A trap, a death sentence disguised as salvation. And Marcus, who had once bled beside him, who had laughed and sworn oaths of loyalty, had led him. Elijah's hand moved without thought, drawing his weapon with smooth precision, angling it toward Marcus as he stepped back from the threshold. "End of the line, Marcus," Elijah said coldly. Marcus froze, his mask slipping, his mouth working silently for a moment before the words tumbled out. "I had no choice," he hissed, desperation clawing into his voice. "They have—" Elijah's grip tightened on the weapon, fury and betrayal swirling like a maelstrom inside him. "And what about me?" he asked quietly. "Was I just another body to cover your tracks?" Marcus's face twisted in agony. "I didn't want to," he choked out, "but they said if you disappeared during the chaos, no one would question it. Not with everything going to hell." Elijah's jaw clenched. Shadow stood between them now, teeth bared, a low growl rattling his frame, daring Marcus to make a move. For a long moment, the hallway vibrated with the weight of unspoken choices, the fragile line between violence and mercy stretching thin. Finally, Elijah holstered his weapon slowly, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "You want to save your family," he said, voice flat as steel. "Then you help me stop this." Marcus hesitated, caught in the gravitational pull of guilt and survival, then nodded stiffly, shoulders sagging with the weight of his decision. Elijah stepped carefully around the tripwire, Shadow glued to his side, and together they pushed forward, deeper into the darkness, where blood and betrayal waited in equal measure. The corridors twisted deeper into the courthouse's forgotten belly, the concrete walls weeping with condensation, the air thick with mildew and old secrets. Elijah moved swiftly but silently, Marcus trailing behind with a heavy, guilt-laden gait while Shadow prowled ahead, every sense straining into the darkness. They passed broken pipes, discarded office furniture, the detritus of a once proud system now hollowed out and rotting from within. Every step hammered urgency into Elijah's blood. Every second meant Jericho's life slipping further into peril, and the evidence needed to expose Judge Whitmore slipping into oblivion. They reached a wide service chamber, its floor strewn with fallen ceiling tiles and abandoned crates. And for a moment Elijah hesitated, scanning the room for threats. Shadow froze near a stack of rusted filing cabinets, his nose working furiously, tail stiff. Elijah's heart quickened. He stepped carefully toward the spot, boots crunching against debris, following the line of Shadow's focus. Nestled between the cabinets, half concealed under a torn tarp, was an old portable safe, the kind often used for transporting sensitive court records off-site. Elijah knelt and brushed the grime from its keypad, noting that it had been recently used. Faint fingerprints streaked across the dust. He tried the obvious codes first, the year the courthouse was built, the case number for Caldwell, but the safe blinked red at every attempt. Marcus shifted anxiously nearby. "There's no time," he hissed. "We'll be caught down here." Elijah ignored him, thinking fast, then typed in Whitmore's judicial badge number. A long shot, but worth the risk. The safe beeped approvingly and clicked open. Inside, stacked neatly in manila envelopes, were rows of tapes and documents, all stamped confidential in heavy black ink. Elijah grabbed a handful of them, tearing open the nearest envelope with shaking hands. A cassette tape tumbled into his palm. He jammed it into the battered recorder still strapped to his vest, pressed play, and listened as the hiss of static gave way to voices. The first voice was unmistakable Judge Whitmore, tone oily and commanding. "Once the first blast triggers confusion," Whitmore said coolly, "eliminate the witness immediately. No loose ends. No survivors outside the plan." Elijah closed his eyes for half a second, letting the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. Proof. Irrefutable, damning proof. Whitmore's voice continued, laying out the details with chilling precision. The compromised bailiffs, the manipulated jury selection, the planned destruction of physical evidence. Every thread tying back to the Marquez syndicate. Every piece of the puzzle snapping into place with horrifying clarity. Elijah clicked off the tape, shoved it into a secure pouch, and rose to his feet, heart pounding. "We have him," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have everything." But even as the victory surged within him, Shadow emitted a low whine, his body twisting sharply toward a ventilation shaft tucked behind the cabinets. Elijah frowned, moving closer. Shadow's nose was pressed to the rusted grate, his paws scrabbling slightly at the edges. Elijah knelt, feeling along the frame, until he found the release mechanism and popped it open. A gust of stale air whooshed out, carrying with it the scent of oil, paper, and cold metal. Without hesitation, Shadow plunged into the crawl space beyond, and Elijah, adrenaline sharpening his senses, followed, Marcus stumbling after them. The tunnel was tight and oppressive, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees, the narrow space amplifying every breath, every scrape of fabric against concrete. After several agonizing minutes, they emerged into a hidden room larger, cleaner, and meticulously organized. Filing cabinets lined the walls, digital servers blinked in the corners, and a series of heavy safes stood along one side like silent sentinels. It wasn't just a hideout, it was an archive, a private vault of corruption hidden in the courthouse's bones. Shadow stood proudly in the center of the room, chest heaving, tongue lolling slightly, his tail wagging once in grim satisfaction. Elijah rose to his feet, awe and fury warring inside him. He approached the nearest cabinet, yanking it open to reveal folders labeled with names he recognized: prosecutors, police chiefs, councilmen, judges, all implicated in an intricate web of bribery, blackmail, and blood. Photos, financial records, surveillance footage. A treasure trove of evidence meticulously cataloged and concealed. Elijah's fingers trembled as he flipped through the files, the scale of the conspiracy unfolding before him like a cancer exposed to the light. They had been running the city like a puppet show for decades, and Whitmore had been their master of ceremonies, pulling the strings behind the velvet curtains of justice. Marcus hovered behind him, breathing heavily, the enormity of their discovery sinking in. "You could bring down half the city with this," Marcus said, voice barely above a whisper. Elijah turned, meeting his gaze with steel. "We will," he said. Shadow barked once, short and sharp, the sound echoing in the chamber like a battle cry. Elijah secured as much evidence as he could carry, stuffing files and hard drives into his tactical pack. Every second a countdown toward discovery. Somewhere above, in the burning wreck of the courtroom, Whitmore and his allies would already be regrouping, closing nets, sharpening knives. But they were too late. The truth had been unearthed, dragged from the shadows by a man and his dog who refused to bow to fear or corruption. Elijah slung the pack over his shoulder, patted Shadow's flank, and motioned toward the service tunnel leading out the other side of the vault. They had the proof. Now they needed to survive long enough to use it. The morning after the courthouse bombing dawned gray and grim, the city's skyline shrouded under low, oppressive clouds, as if the heavens themselves braced for the reckoning to come. In the emergency tribunal hastily assembled across town, the atmosphere buzzed with a volatile mix of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. The remnants of the old order filled the gallery of lawyers, officials, officers, some clutching onto desperate hope, others barely concealing the tremble of panic beneath their polished veneers. Elijah sat at the prosecution table, still clad in tactical gear smeared with dust and grime, Shadow pressed faithfully against his leg, the battered evidence pack secured at his side, the files, the recordings, the documents all ready to be unveiled in one surgical strike, designed not just to wound but to decapitate the syndicate's influence at its rotten core. Across the room, Judge Whitmore sat hunched at the defendant's table, stripped of his robes, his face a mask of icy defiance barely hiding the frantic calculation in his darting eyes. Every inch of the courtroom crackled with tension, the audience leaning forward in breathless anticipation as the clerk called the session to order. Elijah rose as the prosecutor, a woman as sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous, laid out the preliminary charges with ruthless efficiency, citing corruption, conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. Then, with the flourish of a magician pulling back a velvet curtain, she gestured to Elijah. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the blood roaring in his ears, and began to speak, reciting the evidence chain with brutal precision. The room shifted with every revelation. Gasps of horror, murmurs of disbelief as Elijah played snippets of Whitmore's own voice from the recovered tapes, mapping the web of criminal alliances that stretched through the city like cracks in a foundation. But it wasn't enough just to tell them, they had to see it. Elijah motioned to Shadow, who rose gracefully and followed him to the witness stand, earning a ripple of murmured surprise from the crowd. Elijah clicked the remote in his hand, projecting the scanned files onto a large screen behind the bench documents, signatures, payoff ledgers, and every stroke of ink another nail in the coffin of the old regime. And then, with the entire courtroom watching, Elijah ordered, "Shadow, stand." The shepherd stepped onto the low platform before the witness stand, his presence both dignified and defiant, the living symbol of loyalty that had outlasted betrayal. Across the aisle, Whitmore locked eyes with the dog that had haunted his plans, his composure cracking for the first time since his arrest. His hands trembled on the table's edge, his jaw worked soundlessly, and for one terrible stretched-out heartbeat the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of truth pressed down with relentless force, more powerful than any argument, any plea. Shadow stared back at Whitmore, his body perfectly still except for the slow, deliberate wag of his tail, not friendly, but final, as if acknowledging a foe brought low by his own hand. Whitmore's shoulders sagged visibly, the last of his defiance bleeding out as he rose on unsteady legs. His voice, when it came, was a rasp of broken glass dragged over stone. "I confess," he said, eyes never leaving Shadow's steady, merciless gaze. "I confess to everything." Gasps burst from the crowd, reporters scrambling to scribble notes, cameras flashing like lightning storms in the packed chamber. Elijah watched without triumph, without vindication, only with the cold satisfaction of duty fulfilled. It was over. The trial that had started with lies and blood had ended with truth and justice. Shadow returned to Elijah's side, leaning against his leg, accepting a quiet scratch behind the ears as the judge ordered Whitmore taken into custody. In the days that followed, the files they uncovered from the secret archive tore through the city's political elite like wildfire, toppling careers, dismantling networks of power and influence that had reigned unchecked for decades. There were threats, attempts at intimidation, even a few desperate strikes against Elijah himself, but they all failed. The city was awake now, its people hungry for something pure, something earned. Shadow became a symbol, his image plastered across headlines and murals alike, the silent sentinel who had refused to bow even when men of power demanded it. Elijah stood quietly one evening on the courthouse steps, Shadow seated beside him, the city lights sprawling out before them like a galaxy made real. He thought of the battles fought, the friends lost, the corruption gutted from the heart of a dying system. It had cost them dearly, but the city had been given a second chance. Blood-stained, fragile, but real. He looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with eyes full of quiet understanding, and Elijah smiled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "We did it, buddy," he said, voice rough with emotion. Shadow wagged his tail once, slow and certain, as if agreeing that even in a world built on lies and shadows, truth could still win, so long as someone or something was willing to fight for it. If this story moved you, if it made you hold your breath or race through each moment alongside Elijah and Shadow, consider leaving a like and subscribing to follow more stories where loyalty, courage, and truth battle against impossible odds. Which moment in the story struck you the hardest? Was it the betrayal, the courtroom showdown, or the final confession? And tell me, where in the world are you reading from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective.